and welcome. So today's schedule, we're going to be talking about IT assurance and best practice. We're joined by two very much experts within the Moore ClearComm team in this area. We're going to focus on probably a longer list of subjects than we would in previous webinars. We're going to focus on IT assurance and talk about what that is exactly and how it might relate to your organization, with a focus also on some specific business sectors and types of personas that would perhaps have an increased focus and interest in this area, or a need to be thinking about it in terms of their business practice. We'll talk a lot about measuring risk and defining risk surface, because that's something we talk a lot about at Moore ClearComm in terms of every organization having risks that they may need to accept and mitigate in different ways. The guys will talk us through some of their recent case studies, which will hopefully put some of everything we've talking about today into more context. And then we'll drill down more deeply into talking about IT risk and financial reporting and audits. We'll talk about the generic and mid to long-term positive impacts and tangible impacts of everything we're going to be talking about today. And then ideally we'll have some time at the end for questions. So I'm joined today by, as I say, two fantastic experts from within the Moore ClearComm team, Maritz and Benji. Guys, if I could just invite you to introduce yourselves briefly, and then we can move on. Very much in the hands of the experts today. This is something they will lead on through the session. Thanks, Maritz.
Thank you. Hi, so my name is Maritz. You'll hear a bit of my voice today. I'm the Director of IT Assurance Services within Moore ClearComm. So my team is responsible for looking after delivering IT assurance services to various end users. So we've got our own internal organization who we support on the financial audit side of things, but actually we're doing quite a lot of work with end clients as well, to sort of help them understand the IT environment and where they can improve using IT assurance. So yeah, that's me, Benji.
Hi everyone, my name is Benji. I work with Maritz. I'm the Senior Manager for IT Assurance. I support and manage the team in terms of resources and projects. So as Maritz mentioned, part of IT Assurance is supporting the finance auditors in performing the IT risk assurance. As part of ISA 315, we also perform other engagements like SOC reviews, SOC compliance reviews, ISO 27001 reviews, SWIFT cybersecurity self-assessment, and cybersecurity compliance engagements too as well. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm hoping to share my experience to everyone in the IT audit realm. Yeah, Maritz, over to you.
Thanks,
guys. Yeah, sorry, I was just going to mention that, yeah, both email addresses for Maritz and Benji are available, so please reach out to both at any point. And let's just move on. We'll start looking at some key definitions. So something that Maritz and I were talking about at length yesterday, and give me a sort of a deeper understanding of the difference between IT assurance and information assurance. So I'll briefly talk us through this one, and then Maritz will take the lead from here on. So IT assurance is very much about a promise given to users of IT systems to inspire reasonable confidence in the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which are words and phrases that crop up continually in our field of work, of the information systems with levels of acceptable risk. And users that can therefore include customers, clients, stakeholders, and suppliers. And before I hand over to the next part, Maritz, I think acceptable risk is a key phrase, isn't it, in cybersecurity and IT assurance?
Absolutely. I think everybody's got a tolerance of risk, and it's always going to be a balance between what you spend on mitigating risk and what you accept as a business is sort of broadly within your risk tolerance. So if you, for example, look at risks that might have a low impact and very unlikely to happen, then you may decide to actually, well, let's monitor that risk. We're not going to do anything about it. But if you've got a risk that's got high impact and high likelihood to happen, then that's definitely something you want to do something about. I think the IT assurance side of things helps you unearth those risks really within the business, where it's not areas you normally look into in particular depth, but those are sort of the bits and pieces which can come around and bite you in the backside if you don't look at it in more detail. Cool. And I think the other bit that we just wanted to cover off is the difference between IT assurance and IT audit. So IT assurance is sort of the wider piece around providing that confidence that the systems that you're using actually operate as expected, and you can rely on the data within it and so on. IT audit is really more of a tool to help you understand what that looks like. So typically an audit is when you examine IT infrastructure, you look at policies, you look at processes, you look at the business, mainly to identify, for example, how you match up against good practice, to look at when you're actually operating your IT environment in certain parts of the IT environment, is there any specific risks in there that you need to worry about? So the auditing side of things is really the tool we use to be able to determine where you are against a set framework or a set of requirements. So normally what happens is with an audit is you'll agree what sort of framework you're auditing against, or what sort of set of standards or requirements you're auditing against. You carry out the work. That's where you identify where your potential risk areas are, and then ultimately you'll have recommendations or actions on the back of that. So with the focus broadly being around strategy, policy, security, or even technical architecture. So that's really the IT audit side of things. So that's sort of doing the deep dive into specific topics, for example. So yeah, so it's quite a key tool for us actually in the IT assurance world.
Yeah.
To carry out audits. So when we look at IT assurance, maybe in a slightly broader term, so that's really is the tool that you use, or the mechanism that you use to make sure that your IT systems are functioning properly and securely, you're protecting corporate assets, you're looking at data integrity. And I think the biggest area of IT assurance is making sure that your IT and your business goals actually overlap. So that when you've got IT within the environment, it's actually helping you move towards your business goals rather than being distracting. So it's potentially wider than just security. It's also about whether it aligns with your strategic purpose of your business as well. So that IT assurance elements can sort of provide you with that steer as well. And the way that we could potentially do that, and that's something we use quite significantly within our sort of framework of delivery, is we use a framework called COBIT. So COBIT is a framework for IT governance and IT management. It's quite closely aligned to ITIL as well. So those of you who run IT departments, you're probably aware of ITIL, probably aware of ISO 20001. But essentially, it's a framework that was developed by Azaka, and it is available from Azaka if you want to download it. I think you may have to buy a membership, or you may have to have a certified information security auditor potentially to be able to access that, but it is accessible to the general public. And it's really a set of objectives, and I'll show you what the framework looks like in a second, to sort of help you define from a process and policy perspective what your IT organization should be doing. It's really much more focused around the management of IT rather than the technology side of things. But it does provide quite a broad set of, I guess, good practice to pick from when you start looking at your own IT organization as well. And again, it's sort of there to help you align your IT goals with your business goals as well. And we use it normally as a basis for any IT assurance program we follow. So we'll pick from the framework, which the key bits are we maybe want to look at for the clients, and we'll use COBIT as a guidance and a steer. And I'll show you now, looking at the actual framework itself, you'll see why we tend to sort of pick up something like that. Sorry, it's a bit slow. So the COBIT framework, it looks quite daunting to start off with, but actually this is almost like a manual on how to run IT, right? From a process and policy perspective. Because what it does, it covers off some of the key areas of the IT organization within the business. And it really gives you a lot of detailed framework information of the kind of things that you need to achieve. So it doesn't tell you exactly what you need to do within each of these areas, but it does give you your objectives of what you need to achieve. So it doesn't tell you how to manage your IT, but it says, well, in good practice terms, these are the key things that you need to try and achieve with these parts of IT. Just very briefly running through the COBIT framework. We've got a set of requirements or set of control objectives that focus around how do you evaluate, direct, and monitor your IT organization. So that will deal with what does your governance structure looks like? How do you govern your IT? How do you make sure you achieve your benefits from IT? How do you optimize your resources? How do you ensure stakeholder engagement? The second part, which we use quite a lot as well, is around how you align, plan, and organize. So this is really strategically, how do you fit, how does IT fit into your organization? How does it link in with your business objectives? But then also, how do you manage the sort of soft parts of the business? So how do you manage budget and costs, human resources? How do you manage your vendors and your third parties? Have you got managed service agreements? So again, a lot of these which you can sort of pick from to sort of start looking at, okay, so which one of these areas do we want to focus on? Let's pull out the sort of guidance from COVID and look at how we carry out our assurance around that. It also looks at build, acquire, and implement, which is essentially around how you sort of build new technology within IT. So when you buy bits in, do you build or do you develop your own software? How do you manage IT changes? So really, this is all around sort of managing the change within the IT environment. And then another area which we focus on quite a lot, and this is probably more so in the more traditional financial IT audit side, is how is your IT managed on a day-to-day basis? So these are the key things that you tend to do. You manage operations, you manage service requests and incidents, problems, manage continuity, manage security, and also business process controls. And then lastly, the framework provides some guidance around, okay, so you do all this stuff within IT. How do you monitor, evaluate, and assess that on an ongoing basis to make sure that you optimize your IT environment? So it is very much a framework for large organizations with more complex IT environments. However, there's still a lot of good practice within this framework, which you can pick out even as a smaller organization. So for example, if you only want to focus on change management, or you only want to focus on how do we manage availability and capacity, you can pick from the framework, and that give you some good steer and guidance in terms of how those parts of the business should be implemented. Okay. Benji, I don't know if you've got anything more to say about the COVID side of things in terms of how you tend to use this framework.
Yeah, especially in regards to the governance aspect, which is a key area in terms of establishing you know, technology within the IT landscape, because most of the time it's from my experience where you see where the focus is on technology, implementing technology, but what drives the technology is more of the governance, where you have to evaluate, direct, and monitor, where we are looking at policies that drive technology within the environment, and obviously where you have monitor to as well. In most instances, systems get implemented, but how do we monitor to ensure that there is value for money, even regarding technology being aligned to how do you call it, being aligned to strategies, being aligned to company objectives. So that's where we have the monitoring and making sure that there is proper alignment with technology to the company goals and benefits. So COVID is also very great in terms of you being able to understand and being able to map directly how the systems are driving the business. So it's a great tool, like you mentioned. It's most of the times it's for bigger institutions, but even smaller institutions can pick a page out of these ones in terms of areas like governance, and a few areas like build, acquire, and implement, and also most importantly monitor, because you need to monitor your systems in terms of alignment and also in terms of incidents. That's more about security. So yeah, Covenant is COVID is a great framework that essentially also works with other frameworks like ISO 27001. It sits perfectly with ISOs and other standards as well. Yeah.
So so that was just a very quick overview of COVID, and I think it's something we're putting in everybody's back pocket to say, well, actually, we've got that sort of frame of reference there that we can look back to, both from implementing processes within IT, but also from an IT assurance perspective, to say, are we actually broadly aligning with the good practice that's set out in COVID? So looking at the sort of sectors and industries that are particularly interested in IT assurance. And actually, it sort of sits across the board, because most organizations now, big or small, rely quite significantly on technology. So really, the board and the management of those organizations should really have the confidence to say, well, their systems are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Those systems aren't actually exposing us to unnecessary risk. The systems are run in a competent manner. They're looked after, whether they either run internally or by a third party or by a cloud service provider. So most of the sort of medium to large sectors should have a concern around IT assurance and making sure that they do what they're meant to be doing. So whether that's financial services, charity, non-profits, all of those areas really.
Maritz, you mentioned there briefly the board members and leadership team. So this is something that we talk a lot about in respect of all of our fields of work across privacy and securities. What's the relevance in terms of the leadership teams having this in focus, and would they potentially feel this is for their IT teams to worry about, or is it a responsibility they should definitely have on their table?
I think they should have a responsibility of oversight and having decent oversight over all the parts of their business, really. And they shouldn't neglect the IT side of things. Often you've got CIOs on the board, which is great, or CTOs. But ultimately, there should still be an element of reporting upwards towards the board in terms of how effective your IT environment is. I think the focus over the last few years have gone very much specifically around cybersecurity, for example. So maybe the focus is a bit less on the wider IT aspects of things. But yeah, so I think this is just a call to sort of say, well, actually, we maybe need to start looking at the wider aspect again, so we don't have other risks that are latent within what we're doing from an IT perspective that might actually impact the business should these materialize. Yeah, that's really one of the key things IT assurance is about preemptively trying to identify where those areas are within the IT environment that could potentially cause issues in the long run.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, I support that. And also because technology supports the business, right? So the key focus is the business objectives, and then we have the technology that drives the business. So technology is a tool that facilitates the business objectives. So obviously the board needs to focus on the technology, the delivery of the technology in terms of performance, obviously in terms of cybersecurity, but in terms of value. You know, it's a key area, and monitoring to understand how technology is driving the business at the board level is also a key thing. So within IT assurance, we look at strategic alignment as well, how technology is directly aligned to the business, and how senior management and the board have oversight responsibility in driving technology and not just implementing technology. We could in essence I mean, it might not drive business, but actually drive losses, because if you have a lot of technology, which you don't have management of it, it actually creates losses as well. So, you know, within IT assurance, there is this strategic alignment that gives oversight on that too as well. So obviously everything is driven at the board level in terms of like what Mary showed within the COVID framework. The evaluate, direct, and monitor is at the board level. They direct business and they direct technology and how it should impact the business as well.
That's a great context. Thanks, Benji.
Yeah.
I guess delving a little bit deeper into the reasons and requirements for IT assurance. There's a couple of key drivers out there that's actually driving more focus on the wider IT assurance piece, and that's the demand for third-party assurance. So large organizations, most organizations are to some degree outsourcing a lot of their IT now, whether that's through the use of cloud applications or whether through the use of IT service providers. And whilst they're not delivering those services themselves, they want their third parties to be able to show and demonstrate that they're managing the systems appropriately, both from a cybersecurity perspective, but also from a wider IT governance and IT management perspective. So I think this is driving a lot more requirements in the industry for being able to demonstrate that you are applying good IT governance, and therefore, and that you've got some good assurance processes around that to be able to demonstrate that, especially those sort of processes carried out by third parties. So, for example, I've got ISO on there, I've got SOC, the service, the SOC reporting side of things, where it's not just you telling your clients or your partners that you are carrying out these procedures. You've actually had a third party in to audit it and actually give you proper reports or certificates on the back of that. So there's definitely a big demand for third party assurance. So that's quite a key part. There's quite a lot of regulatory change happening now, and sort of audit standards, for example, is a good example. And we'll touch on ISO 315 a little bit later. for external financial audit, but there's continuous changes in that sort of things. ESG is driving a lot more around corporate governance as well. So that's sort of the environment, social and governance side of things. So that's sort of driving organizations to sort of build on their maturity around the internal governance processes. And IT governance is sort of a key part of that, because that drives organizational efficiency, it drives reduced waste of resources and all sort of good stuff. That's what comes with ESG as well. There's also quite often oversight requirements. So, for example, within the third sector or schools, trustees, governors want to have independent perspective on whether parts of the business is working well, parts of the organization is working well. So often those oversight requirements require inspection of areas such as IT, such as cybersecurity as well, by a third party. And then generally, I think there's just a heightened awareness of technology risk within organizations. So a lot of organizations are using hybrid services now. So they've got some services on site, they've got some services in the cloud. So their risk environment is sort of split up now into various different categories in various areas. Obviously, there's the continuous concern around business resilience in general, and then cyber resilience or cybersecurity has been quite a big topic at board level as well, which has sort of driven the wider concern or the wider focus on IT governance and the wider management of the IT environment as well. So a lot of these sort of drivers are sort of increasing the general need for providing some level of third-level assurance or third-party assurance around whether IT is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And I guess sort of just closing that loop with the risk, a lot of what you do in the IT assurance side is potentially identifying risks. So you're identifying areas where a IT process might not be working the way it should be, an IT system is maybe not configured in an optimal way. And essentially, that's where you then have to ensure that you've got a process in place to manage that IT risk. So, and to be able to manage your IT risk, you need to understand what your core objectives are, your purpose of the business, understand what role the IT environment plays in achieving those objectives, and then defining what the organization's IT risk surface looks like. So that's essentially where can risk appear within our IT landscape. It also factors in any third-party service delivery, and ultimately the aim is to identify risks that require management action. And fundamentally, then carrying out these actions and reevaluating whether these actions actually have been effective. So just digging into what we mean when we say risk surface. So risk surface is really any location where your reputation, your assets, your legal obligations, and your regulatory compliance or ability to operate is at risk, specifically around the IT environment. So it's not necessarily just limited to your technical environment, but it could be your people, it could be your third parties that provide the services to you. I mean, supply chain risk is often overlooked in many cases, where you place a lot of implicit reliance on the third parties taking their responsibility of looking after your data seriously, without potentially doing a little bit more digging, a bit more understanding whether that actually happens. And ultimately, if you implement good IT risk management, that should cover your technical and your IT and your cybersecurity risk, and that should sort of provide you protection around your wider risk surface as well. So that's just what we mean when we say risk surface. Essentially, it's your risk universe is another sort of term that's used quite regularly as well.
I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Maritz, that sort of the last couple of years of our work, our clients and organisations that we engage with are increasingly more aware that their supply chain should be within their sphere of concern, within whether it's data protection or cybersecurity or IT assurance. And previously, maybe it wasn't.
Yeah, and I think it's good that that's becoming a more of a focus area. I think the question just is, how do we get that assurance?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because sometimes the suppliers might sit in a different country, potentially. They're in the cloud, so there's no real physical bits and pieces you can go look at. So, and also contractually, what are you actually allowed to do in terms of getting that level of assurance? So The good thing is sort of the big players like Microsoft and AWS have got trust centers now, so you can actually go and download their reports. They're open and honest about the reports, the third-party assurance reports that they get, and they share that. But obviously, if you use smaller suppliers, you don't necessarily have that level of inherent assurance. So you're going to have to ask yourself in a little bit more detail, so are those suppliers right for us? Are they actually aligned with how we want to manage our risks? And do they sort of operate within our risk appetite, ultimately?
Yeah, and if any of today's guests are interested in finding out a bit more about how the steps they might take or the kind of questions they might seek to ask in respect of supplier risk, please reach out to us after today's session.
But again,
Yeah.
if you use something like COBIT helps you determine what that risk surface looks like, at least from a process perspective. So it can show you where you potentially have gaps in the way that you're managing IT, or where you are carrying out certain activities within IT, like managing change or managing access. It can give you a bit of an insight into, well, actually, there may be gaps within those processes which you're not currently actually covering off. Sorry, Benji, you were going to say?
I think risk, yeah, like you mentioned, risk is a very broad area. And I like the fact that you mentioned the people, the process, and the technology as well. Because the people, in most instances, I mean, within cybersecurity risk landscapes, you see people as the greatest vulnerabilities. So within IT assurance looks at the effectiveness of the management controls which have been implemented within an IT landscape. We give assurance to these controls, because where we get to, like what Mary's mentioned, we understand the business and then we understand the risk impact in the business. So IT assurance evaluate the controls, and where we have inherent risks, then it goes back to risk appetite. So what I have observed is that in most instances, supply chain risk is not managed within clients' risk landscape. So the fact that you've outsourced a function or a service does not mean that you've completely outsourced the risk. The risk still sits with the company. And in most instances, when we look at the risk registers, we don't see supply chain risk. And a great area is placing reliance on third-party reports. So making sure that you get like SOC reports and reviewing the SOC reports occasionally to understand how your third parties have implemented controls to manage your risk, as part of your risk landscape. And that's a great area that needs to be looked at, especially in terms of information. Automation has actually heightened the risk landscape. We are in an era where we have systems that are getting highly automated. We are talking about AIs, we're talking about machine learning, we're talking about cloud services which are traveling all across the world. So supply chain risk is becoming a big area that needs to be managed and monitored, especially from the governance level all the way down to the system owners and to technical controls as well.
Actually, you mentioned the people part. If you do dig into COBIT a little bit, they've got specific controls around how you manage, around managing staff, managing training, managing your competencies within your teams as well. So it's well worth looking into those sort of areas as well, because I know sometimes that sort of thing sort of just happens within an IT organization. You don't really have any specific detailed training plans, for example, for people or level of competencies you expect to see. So again, COBIT can help determine what that part of the IT organization should look like, or at least what you should aspire to.
Yeah, that's true.
So I guess I just wanted to share a case study with you guys of a piece of work we did recently for a multi-academy trust. So we do a lot of work across various industries. And one of the areas that Merkins Smith, our parent company, is particularly well known for is working within charities and the academic sector, specifically around schools. So this piece of work came about by essentially the trustees of a MAT was really concerned about cybersecurity. Obviously, there's been some recent high risk or highly publicized attacks on academic trusts, which effectively took schools out of operation for weeks. And this trust was particularly concerned. They were running 10 primary schools. They didn't have much visibility around what was happening from a cybersecurity perspective. So I know this focuses on cybersecurity. That's just sort of a sub part of IT assurance. But this one was quite an interesting one because we essentially agreed what the sort of general good practice framework is we're going to be following, which was based broadly on COVID and also on a few other external frameworks. And then we carried out that assessment across the 10 schools and measured how they were doing against good practice. It was a very interesting review or assessment or audit. We actually did it as part of their internal audit program. So essentially we were sort of co-sourced as experts from an internal audit perspective. But they've never done this before. They've never looked at their IT environments per se at that top level. And to be fair, the schools haven't really looked at that either because they're providing learning services for students. So, but what we did identify as part of that review was that there was a significant number of IT service providers used within the schools. There were very different levels of competence and standards being followed for cybersecurity. Certainly, we found that cybersecurity requirements weren't included in any contracts or SLAs with any of the service providers, and there wasn't any trust-wide security policies and procedures, which actually meant that we found a lot of issues when we started looking at the detail side of things around just the basic capabilities which we expect to see in place within an IT environment. That included cybersecurity, it included backup and recovery, it included things like patching. So there was quite a lot of gaps, which basically was just down to not necessarily having an overarching umbrella sitting across the school. So, but what this piece of work did actually provide us some really tangible, quantifiable risks around cyber attack for the individual schools. It raised the profile of the fact that the trust need to be more proactive in terms of managing IT in a consistent manner across the schools. You could highlight some very specific risks and also clear steps to address the risks as well. So this is just an example of where you can use a framework to carry out a piece of IT assurance work, which ultimately has some really good outcomes for the school because they've got a very clear map going forward in terms of how to actually improve that cybersecurity resilience side of things.
In this instance, Maritz, and maybe generally in other instances, when you provide the results of the exercise, are the clients generally surprised? Did they believe they were in a better position than they ultimately were, or was it pretty much what they expected, or is it generally quite mixed?
I think it's normally mixed because often we get called in when somebody already has concerns, and it's more about bottoming out what those concerns are and working out actually, so what can we actually do about these? I think in this case, it's the first time they've ever looked at this side of things. So I think I know, Benji, you guys were presenting to the trustees, back to the trustees in terms of what we found. And I think they probably did not expect it, but they probably didn't expect it to be quite as diverse and different across the schools.
Yeah. I think they were aware of most of the issues, but I think it's and most especially, the school, part of what we did was to ensure that the school was complying with an RPA policy, so that was one of the key areas that we looked at. So they wanted to ensure that they were complying with RPA policy standards and cybersecurity standards, and that's where IT assurance comes in to evaluate compliance of controls against certain standards, which also drives value within the business. So the clients, well, they were aware of some of the issues, but to a large extent, they were open to some of the deficiencies which were identified. I guess it's more of using a standard to evaluate, the deficiencies and giving a collective overview of what was happening within the environment, including gaps from the governance side of things, gaps from technology side of things, gaps from people management side of things. So that collective, report gave a true picture of what was happening within the environment. So I guess that's where standards like COVID comes in. So you don't only look at a one-sided picture, because you need to look at the 360-degree of what is happening within your environment. And like Mary's mentioned, a key area within the report is governance. They had outsourced contracts to about 4 or 5 service providers, and within the service provider contracts, there was no mention of cybersecurity. So the responsibility of cybersecurity that sits with the service providers had not been defined at the board level. Even at the board level, there is no responsibility of cybersecurity. So that's where standards like COVID comes in, and we have standards like cybersecurity standards, ISO standards. It helps you to get an overview of the gaps within your environment and also how to address it. So you take a holistic approach in addressing risk within your IT landscape.
When you're carrying out these exercises, Benji, do you factor in the sector likelihood? So, for instance, the most recent National Cybersecurity Breaches Survey again sort of reinforced that education, any school is statistically more likely to be attacked than the typical business. So, does that factor into this, or are you purely looking at what they've got in place?
So the using a standard helps you to it gives you the framework to evaluate the cybersecurity gaps, the IT control gaps, the governance gaps. So the standard in itself gives you a guide on what to look at, the framework to assess those gaps. It doesn't really give you, obviously, I mean, whilst we do these evaluations, we are well aware of some of the key sectors that easily get hit. So that also influences, as part of our scoping, that influences the controls or the evaluations that we put in place for our assessment.
I think it'll definitely raise when we start, because normally we report based on risk levels. And that sort of thing will probably raise some of the risk levels, because inherently the risk is a little bit higher. So a risk that might have been a yellow for one industry might be a red for another one.
Yeah, excellent.
If you just want it just as an example. Okay. So the next bit I wanted to touch on very briefly is how IT risk and IT assurance is now sort of making its way into financial reporting audits. So if you're part of a very large organization and you were audited, you've sort of routinely been audited by the KPMGs or the PwCs or the Big Four or the Big Six of the world, then you'll be well used to IT being part of that financial audit. That's now sort of changed down to making sure that the standards have effectively changed to say auditors as a whole for any sector needs to consider the risk around IT systems, and what that risk could mean from an audit perspective in terms of data. And the principle is really, fact is, management and auditors rely on data on a day-to-day basis to make decisions. So they rely on the fact that the data on their systems are complete, consistent, accurate, valid, and timely, especially on the sort of key parts of the transaction within the business. If you're very sales focused, your process of generating sales all the way into getting into the sales ledger is really, really important for accuracy of reporting, and also very, very important from an auditor coming in and sort of stamping the book saying, yeah, you're fine. But the cognizant of the fact that unfortunately IT systems can be complex for some organizations, there's a risk that IT systems could be poorly designed. They could be managed in a manner that's not necessarily considered good practice, or ultimately they could be abused in a manner not originally designed or intended for. And that could undermine the data and the quality on that systems, which is an issue for management, because management needs to make decisions based on the data that comes out of those systems. But also from an audit perspective, an auditor needs to be able to rely on that same data as well. Otherwise, they end up having to do a massive amount of additional work to be able to say, yes, your business is actually operating as per the financial report, as per the financial reporting. So that's really where ISA 315 has come from. So essentially, that's the standard that sort of governs audits, both in the UK and probably across the rest of Europe as well. So this is specifically the UK one, but I think ISA 315 is well known across the continent. And essentially, what the ISA 315 said, as an auditor, the audit team have to evaluate the client's use of IT and what the potential risk of material misstatement is through that for significant losses of transactions. So that's quite financially focused, but fundamentally that just means that most of you who are involved in the audit process from a day-to-day or from a year-to-year basis will start getting a lot more questions about your IT environment and asking about how your IT environment plays a role in your financial reporting. The kind of risks that auditors worry about is access controls. So you'll sort of see that if you know COVID, you'll see a lot of this links back to the COVID framework again. Are you managing access properly? How are you managing changes? Against change control is a key COVID control area. Cybersecurity, security is a key COVID control area. Are you managing cybersecurity properly on that system? We've got data interfaces. Are those running properly? So are you reliably transferring data from one system to another? I think I might have lost control. Richard, give me 1 second. I just need to. Oh, I've lost control, Richard, for some reason. You just go on to the next bit. I think we might have actually lost Richard. Oh no.
Yeah, I think Richard is frozen.
Okay. That's fine. I'll share my screen. Sorry guys, technical difficulty. I think we lost Richard. Richard's lost his let's see. Yep, Richard's dropped off. So share my screen. So guys, sorry everybody, just bear with us. We had it all set up and I don't know how to share the screen. Bear with 1 second. So Molly, is that something you can help with in the background? Sorry.
Do you want me to share mine? I think I can share from here.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Have you got the latest one now, Benji?
Not the latest. I think I got the one you shared last night.
I don't have a share option on my display, unfortunately.
So it's
Hang on, let me just send
I don't believe much has changed from the 18, slide 18, so I can share mine.
Okay, if you can share.
Yeah, let me show it. If that's going to help.
There's a big share button there. Yeah, great job.
Can you see my screen?
I'll share quickly, that's fine. I've got the latest one. Right. Sorry, everybody, technical glitch. So where was I? Yeah, so the other two areas would then be disaster recovery. So if you've had an issue in the year, we will want to see whether disaster recovery has been followed properly. And then lastly, system migration. So if you had a migration in the course of the year, have you managed to change effectively and have you moved the data successfully? So just a quick case study then. Benji, do you want to take us through the case study briefly? So this is the one we did for that recruitment organization, just to show a little bit about how practically this works. You can see my screen, right?
Yeah. Oh, I was sharing mine. I thought. Yeah, obviously. So part of the case studies was first thing we did was to do data flows. It helps us to understand what are the finance systems, how do the finance systems communicate to each other? Is it in terms of APIs, other automated processes, or through a manual process? So this is actually the initial stage of our risk assessment. It helps us to get an overview of the finance systems and how they communicate. So that helps us to understand if the client environment is manually driven or it is very automated. So part of ISA 315, like Mary's mentioned, it's an IT risk assessment for client for client environments that seems to be complex. That means that environments that have complex finance systems, they have highly automated processes in place. That's where they need specialists like us to get on board to give assurance on the risk within the client's environment. So this case was an instance where the client had a complex environment. So we did risk assessment in terms of after we had done the data flows, we were able to identify the key risks that could impact the financials. And obviously, some of the key risks were access control risk, change control risk. So access control risk, which I wanted to talk about in Mary's slide, in most instances, you could see a lot of permissions granted to IT users, even on finance systems. Permissions like super user access being granted to almost a lot of people in IT and also a lot of people in finance users. In the finance department, these permissions which we grant as super users and as elevated permissions need to be monitored, and to a large extent, least privileged access controls need to be enforced. So we've seen many instances where there have been a lot of access permission violations, where people are granted access which is not required, especially for privilege and super user access, and also change controls. The question is, in instances where the client has a bespoke environment where they are making changes to the finance systems, the question is that how is change managed within the environment? Does it undergo proper change management process, such that the one who makes the change isn't the same person who uploads the change into the production environment? Are there segregation of duty controls in place? Do these changes undergo approvals before they get sent into the production environment? All these management controls within these change processes to ensure that the risk regarding system disruptions, cybersecurity risks are being managed within that process. So part of what we do is also looking at these key risks and giving assurance that there are established controls to addressing risk within these control areas. We undergo 2 stages of testing: the test of design, and most of the times we just do a test of one, just understand the design of the process. It feeds back to what Mary's mentioned, understanding the business process, and where we identify management controls within the test of design stage. And after that, we test operating effectiveness. That's a system could have a design in place, but it doesn't mean it's operating effectively. So we do sampling methodologies just to evaluate if the controls have been implemented accordingly. So yes, financial statement audit, as far as IT assurance is concerned, helps to give the finance auditors confidence that the finance systems are complete, the information within the finance systems are complete, accurate, and that they can rely on these systems to perform their financial statement audit. It's where we only get involved where the systems are complex and the finance systems are automated, and they have a lot of automated processes in place. Yeah, Maritz.
Thank you, Benji. I guess this is just to sort of demonstrate that IT assurance is not necessarily just as an optional element that you need to carry out. Often it's something that's required by audit standards as well to be able to demonstrate. And I think that's coming down to smaller and smaller organizations given the change of the auditing standards. So don't be surprised if your auditors ask you for much more technical IT information than what they're used to in the past as well. Got one question in the QA. So does the impact on going concern assumption come into play? I don't actually know because I'm not a financial auditor, Curtis. So sorry about that. But what I'll do is we'll get back to you on that question afterwards, and we'll share the answer to that as well. Yeah, we tend to sort of focus more on the pure IT side of things, and the partners and the audit team tend to sort of focus on the sort of wider question. So very briefly, just sort of looking at some of the positive impacts, which I think we've talked about a little bit as well, in terms of taking a bit more proactive view on IT assurance. So I guess one of the main benefits you have, if you take a bit more of a proactive view on getting IT assurance, either internally within your own teams or getting an external to come in, is about identifying and treating IT risks before they materialize. And also, if risks do materialize, it's not unexpected. So you would have maybe identified a risk already. You've decided maybe not to not to mitigate the risk, but a risk materializes anyway, and then you can manage the impact because it's a little bit more of a planned or expected outcome. Generally, it can improve your overall organizational resilience because you're building more controls and more risk mitigation within the business as well. Certainly, when you work with a lot of partners and clients, having a bit more of a proactive approach around looking after your IT environment in this perspective does sort of demonstrate IT risk awareness, proactiveness to partners and suppliers. And it's all about sort of presenting a bit of a culture of continuous improvement and risk management as well. The findings could also feed into your IT strategy. You may find out there's certain parts of the IT area that's really not working very well. And you need to take more of a strategic approach. You maybe implement a new system, change the IT organization itself potentially. So it could potentially feed into sort of the wider IT strategy as well. And then ultimately also meeting compliance requirements as well. So I think that's sort of some of the tangible impacts that slightly more proactive approach to IT assurance can provide you. Okay, so I guess it's sort of back to questions from the couple more questions in here. So one about rates. Do you offer reduced rates for IT assurance services for charities and not-for-profit organizations? So yeah, that's probably more of a commercial question. I think we do offer quite competitive rates as it is. And I think maybe we can carry out the review. I think just reach out to us directly and we can have a chat about that. Really depends on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and Mary's, I wanted to add, so yeah, it also depends on the client environment. So for charity, we know though charity is not in terms of risk, you know, so we look at the risk of the risk regarding to the sector, and also we look at the systems and the environment to look, and also we look at the management requirement in terms of what management is specifically looking at and looking for, and that drives our scope and that impacts the fee. So it's all about management requirement more than fee. We look at what management want to achieve, because IT assurance can be very broad. Do they want to look at cybersecurity? Do they want to look at governance, or do they want to look at the general framework? So that feeds into the fee, but we normally focus more on the management objective, and we try to scope out the test procedures to meeting those objectives before we even talk about fees. But obviously we have different fees for different sectors.
And I would say the charity sector in general tends to have a slightly more straightforward IT environment.
Exactly.
In general, obviously there are bigger charities out there that's got complex environments, but for the most part, it's fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I think that's it really from everybody. So yeah, thank you very much for listening in today. Sorry we lost Richard. He's normally our very capable compare. But I think we'll probably call it there. Thank you very much everybody for joining. And actually we have got our next webinar, before I forget to mention that, around data protection, which is a little bit more topic specific, and it will be on Wednesday the 22nd of May. Between 10 and 11 a.m. We've got Rich again, and then we've got Megan, who's an absolute expert in in data protection. Megan used to work for the ICO, so she's really a go-to person for asking a lot of really good questions. So thank you very much again for joining, and we will
Thanks everyone.
we'll see you again soon.
Cheers everyone.